A senior U.S. intelligence official handpicked by President Donald Trump just walked away from one of the most sensitive desks in American national security. Not quietly, not through back channels. He posted his resignation letter on X for the entire world to read. And in doing so, he did something almost nobody inside this administration has dared to do. He told the president publicly that the war in Iran was built on a lie. Joe Kent, director of the National Counterterrorism Center, a decorated combat veteran with 11 tours and a Gold Star spouse, did not just resign. He detonated a controlled charge under the administration's entire justification for the conflict. One man, one letter, and suddenly the architecture holding up the case for war is shaking in ways the White House never anticipated. This is not a personnel story. This is the first visible crack inside Trump's own national security machine, and it carries implications for the war, for the mega coalition, and for the intelligence the president used to put American forces in harm's way. Think of it as a fracture running through the blueprint of a building everyone assumed was solid. The building is still standing, but the engineers just heard the steel groan. In the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly what Kent said, why the White House never saw this coming, and why the ground beneath America's Iran strategy looks fundamentally different today than it did 48 hours ago. Now, imagine something for a moment. Let us rewind the clock, because this resignation did not materialize out of thin air. It emerged from a pressure cooker that has been building since the first American strikes hit Iranian soil. When the initial wave of attacks began, President Trump cited an imminent threat to the United States. Administration officials told the public that Iran was preparing preemptive strikes against American forces deployed across the region. The message was urgent, clear, and designed to shut down debate before it started. Act now or risk American lives. But behind closed doors on Capitol Hill, the story was already coming apart. Pentagon officials briefing lawmakers painted a starkly different picture. Defense leaders told members of Congress that Iran was not planning to attack unless it was struck first. The imminent threat framing, the very foundation of the war's legal and political justification, was contradicted by the military's own assessments before the rubble had cooled, and the administration's public rationale kept shifting like sand. First, the war was about protecting Iranian demonstrators who took to the streets in January. Then it became about preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons and long-range delivery systems. Then it morphed into a generational mission to eliminate a regime that had backed terrorist groups responsible for killing Americans for decades. Trump called on the Iranian people to seize control of their own country, even as his top officials insisted this was not about regime change. The goalposts did not just move. They were replaced entirely, as if someone swapped out the field while the game was still being played. Through all of this, Joe Kent was watching from inside the machine. He had access to intelligence. He occupied one of the most sensitive counterterrorism positions in the entire U.S. government. And what he saw, according to his own written words, did not match what the president was telling the American people. The question was never whether someone inside would eventually say so. The question was when and how loudly. So, let us lay out the evidence. 3 moves, 3 receipts. Receipt number 1, the letter itself. Kent did not offer vague discomfort or polite diplomatic disagreement. He put specific explosive claims in writing and published them for the world to read. He stated that Iran posed no imminent threat to the United States. He stated that the war was initiated due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. And he drew a direct historical line to the Iraq War, accusing Israeli officials and sympathetic media of constructing an echo chamber that deceived the president into believing that striking first would produce a clear path to victory. His exact words were devastating. This was a lie and is the same tactic the Israelis used to draw us into the disastrous Iraq war that cost our nation the lives of thousands of our best men and women. We cannot make this mistake again. Consider who is saying this. A man with 11 combat tours over 20 years in the Army. A former CIA officer, a Gold Star spouse whose first wife, Shannon, was killed by a suicide bomber in Syria while serving as a Navy cryptologist. This is not a bureaucrat leaking to a reporter from behind a curtain of anonymity. This is a man who buried his wife because of the last war built on contested intelligence, standing up in broad daylight and saying he will not be part of the next one. That is not something you dismiss with a tweet, and yet the White House tried. Receipt number 2, the Pentagon contradiction. Kent's claims do not exist in a vacuum. They land directly on top of an already fractured credibility structure. Defense officials briefing Capitol Hill had already contradicted the administration's imminent threat narrative weeks before Kent went public, telling lawmakers that Iran had no plans to attack American forces unless the United States struck first. Members of Congress and independent analysts had raised pointed questions about the quality of the intelligence used to justify military action. Senator Mark Warner, the top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, captured the paradox with surgical precision. He said he strongly disagreed with many of Kent's past positions and warned against politicizing the intelligence community. But on the central claim, Warner was unequivocal. There was no credible evidence of an imminent threat from Iran that would justify rushing the United States into another war of choice in the Middle East. When the opposition's most senior intelligence voice agrees with your own presidential appointee's reason for quitting, the problem is no longer a communications challenge. It is structural. The foundation has a crack that no press conference can plaster over. Receipt number 3, the mega fracture. Kent is not a lone denter shouting into an empty room. His resignation lands squarely in the middle of a growing rift inside the very movement that returned Trump to power. Tucker Carlson has been openly critical of the war. Megyn Kelly has raised sharp objections. Joe Rogan, Theo Vaught, and Tim Dillon, the podcasting forces credited with energizing Trump's 2024 coalition, have turned skeptical of the president over foreign policy. These are not fringe commentators. These are the architects of the media ecosystem that carried Trump across the finish line. Now, polls still show broad rank and file support. An NBC News survey found 77% of Republicans and 90% of self-described mega-Republicans backed the strikes on Iran. But underneath that headline number, the tectonic plates are shifting. The percentage of Republicans viewing Israel positively dropped from 63% in 2023 to 54%. The base is holding for now. But the influencers who shape where the base goes next are already peeling away. And in modern politics, the influencers move first. The base follows always. If this story is connecting dots you have not seen assembled anywhere else, you are already ahead of most people watching this unfold. Hit subscribe right now. This situation is moving faster than any single outlet can track. And the next chapter could arrive before the week is out. You need to be here when it drops. Here is what makes Kent's move so structurally dangerous for the White House and so difficult to neutralize. Most officials who disagree with a war either swallow their objections or leak anonymously to journalists. Kent did neither. He went to Vice President J.D. Vance first, sat down in a room with both Vance and Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard present, laid out his reasoning in detail, and presented his resignation letter. He then spoke with Susie Wilds, Trump's chief of staff, before making a single public statement. He followed the chain of command to the letter. He gave the administration every opportunity to respond internally before he said a word in public. That is not the behavior of a rogue actor. That is the behavior of someone who wanted the record to be clean, so that when the letter landed, no one could dismiss it as impulsive. They could only engage with the substance. And the White House's response reveals how seriously they took the threat. Trump called Kent very weak on security and said, when somebody is working with us that says they didn't think Iran was a threat, we don't want those people. They're not smart people, or they're not savvy people. Officials scrambled to claim Kent had been sidelined from intelligence briefings on Iran and was already on his way out. One senior official said the White House had told Gabbard to fire Kent before the resignation, but she never did. Another official flatly disputed that account. The result is a tangle of contradictions that no single narrative can contain. Was Kent important enough to attend briefings, or was he irrelevant? Was he about to be fired, or was that never discussed? Was the intelligence airtight, or had Pentagon briefers already undermined it on Capitol Hill? Every attempt to shrink Kent's significance opened a new seam in the story. Gabbard's response was perhaps the most telling of all. She posted on social media that the president, as commander-in-chief, is responsible for determining what is and is not an imminent threat. That is technically accurate. It is also the kind of answer you offer when you cannot defend the intelligence on its merits. You retreat to authority. You say the boss decides. And that answer holds right up until the moment the public starts asking whether the boss decided based on evidence or on pressure from outside actors. So what does this actually mean for you? If you are an American taxpayer, you are funding a war whose intelligence justification has now been publicly challenged by a senior presidential appointee and Pentagon briefers alike. If you work in defense, energy, logistics, or any sector connected to Middle East stability, the trajectory of this conflict directly shapes your livelihood. If you have family in uniform, the question of whether this war was necessary is not an abstraction on a cable news panel. It is the most personal question in the world. And here is the part that should keep you up at night. Wars, once started, create their own gravity. Supply chains restructure around the conflict. Defense contracts lock in for years. Alliances calcify. Enemies are created who did not exist before the first bomb fell, even if the political winds shift tomorrow. The institutional commitments forged today do not simply reverse because a poll number dips. The money is spent. The deployments are made. The new enemies remember. You do not unscramble that egg by changing the subject. Where does this go from here? I see three realistic paths. Scenario 1, managed containment. The administration absorbs the blow, dismisses Kent as a fringe figure tainted by past associations with far-right figures and Holocaust deniers, and leans on the strong polling among Republican voters to ride out the storm. The war continues with tightened messaging and perhaps a clearer public articulation of objectives. Kent becomes a footnote remembered only by those already skeptical. This is the White House's preferred outcome, and it remains plausible so long as no further insiders break ranks. Scenario 2, the fracture widens. Kent's public stand emboldens other skeptics inside the administration and across the broader MyJ media universe. More officials, perhaps not at his level, but close enough to matter, begin voicing doubts. The podcasting class amplifies the cracks. Congressional Republicans who privately share Kent's concerns start saying so on the record. The war does not end, but the political coalition sustaining it fragments in ways that constrain the administration's freedom of action. This is the scenario where that 77% approval begins to soften, not because voters change their minds in an instant, but because the information environment shifts beneath their feet. Scenario 3, escalation on every front. The administration doubles down. Trump frames all criticism as disloyalty, weakness, or anti-Semitism. Kent is investigated or discredited. The war expands. Iran retaliates with force. Casualties mount, and the question of whether the intelligence was sound becomes secondary to whether America can afford to be seen losing. This is the scenario nobody wants to name out loud, but it is the one that history tells us is most common. Once a nation commits its military based on contested intelligence, the Iraq precedent is not a metaphor here. It is a warning written in blood. Here is what I keep coming back to. The relationship between this president and his own intelligence community will never look the same after this moment. Even if Kent vanishes from the headlines, even if the war ends in a negotiated settlement next month, the precedent is carved into stone. A Senate-confirmed presidential appointee with combat experience spanning 2 decades looked at the classified intelligence and told the world that the war was built on a lie amplified by a foreign government's lobby. That does not disappear. That lives in the permanent record. And every official who sits in that chair after him will know it. The deeper lesson is older than any single administration. You never construct a case for war on intelligence that cannot survive daylight. You never let a foreign partner's strategic ambitions replace your own independent national security assessment. And you never assume that movement loyalty will silence conscience forever. Eventually, someone breaks ranks. When they do, the question is not whether they were right or wrong in every detail. The question is whether the system that sent young men and women into combat can answer the challenge they just laid down. Did Joe Kent expose a genuine deception at the heart of this war? Or did he simply dress up a policy disagreement in the language of a whistleblower? Is the MAGA coalition resilient enough to absorb this fracture? Or is this the moment the cracks become permanent fault lines? And if the intelligence was wrong, if the imminent threat never existed, who answers for that? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe because the next chapter of this story, the congressional hearings, the classified briefings, the next insider who decides silence is no longer an option, is coming fast. This story is not slowing down. Do not look away. This content is commentary and analysis for informational purposes only. It does not constitute financial, legal, or geopolitical advice.